Looking out over the congregation, I think I can safely say that most of you were alive in 1985. Right? Can you imagine we were alive in the last century? I was born in the middle of the last century. Oh my God. Well, in 1985, that was almost 40 years ago, a big blockbuster movie came out that was called Back to the Future. Do you remember that? It was a fun movie. Great special effects. Really the main character was a DeLorean, a very expensive motor car. And it was kind of the time machine for the actors. And as I say, the special effects were pretty good. And even before that, though, we had Star Wars, which had great special effects. Now, you look at that today, and it's kind of like, that's okay. Or 2001: A Space Odyssey. I think it was in the late 60s. Wow. And today, they computer generate everything. I mean, the artificial intelligence and what they can do with it is really amazing. But the great blockbuster in 1985, almost 40 years ago, was Back to the Future. Well, last night in New York City on Broadway, the musical version of Back to the Future opened. Yeah, a Broadway musical with a DeLorean, which apparently flew out over the audience and was zooming here and there, and many of the critics didn't like the show so much, but they thought what they did with the DeLorean was great. You know what they can do nowadays, and a couple years ago, they had a musical of King Kong. They had this huge mechanical King Kong on stage. Didn't last long, but they do all sorts of things nowadays with special effects. And of course, people love that sort of thing. I mean, we're amazed. I saw, let me see, what did I see that had special effects? Well, I did see Mary Poppins on Broadway. Not a great special effect. I mean, she flew over the audience, okay, big deal. They've been doing that since the beginning of the last century with productions of Peter Pan, But to have, this car zooming everywhere, it's really amazing. And maybe those of us who are older are impressed, but then say, well, so what? Our kids today are impressed by it even more, and they have all these games, playing these games and virtual reality stuff. You put this whatever it is on your eyes, and it's like the real thing's happening. I remember seeing an instance of that on Facebook where a young guy was in a mall. He had one of them on, and he was put into like a little cart, and it was a roller coaster. And he keeps going, ah, woo! He's screaming, because it was so real. And so technology today it's really fantastic. It's also frightening. And the people who invented artificial intelligence are really worried. I mean, it's already at work in our midst, but what will happen if it, kind of gets loose in some way? We don't know. So, as usual, Congress is having hearings trying to decide what to do. But anyway, technology is amazing. Now, in one sense, it can be helpful, especially, let's say, with medicine or travel, but it doesn't redeem us. It's not about salvation. It doesn't necessarily, and might, if it's used properly, help us to understand God a little bit. But in general, we don't need technology to really know who Jesus Christ is. And the sad thing is, we have these amazing readings. We have, God in his glory being shown. Moses went up the mountain and saw the glory of God. When he came down, his face was really bright. He had to put a veil over it because it frightened people. And then we have the story of the Transfiguration. Today is the feast of the Transfiguration. And the three apostles went up, and they were frightened. They fell to the ground when the cloud came over and said, "This is my son." I mean, talk about special effects. That wasn't special effects. It was the real thing. It was truly God doing these things. And yet, are we impressed by that? You know, we read it again and again. Yeah, I know that's what happened. And before technology, the hope is that when people read these stories, they were saying, wow, that's really something. But the wow factor isn't here anymore, which is again sad, because the Bible gives us the greatest story ever told, and it is amazing. And we have these incidents, we have these miracles that if we were there, I think we all say it, you know, if only I was there, wow, that really would have made a difference in my life, or I don't know what I'd do. But now it's rushing off to the movie theater to see the latest movie with artificial intelligence or whatever, or to get the latest virtual reality game or computer game, and that's what grabs us. And it's not helpful. It kind of distracts us from what is most simple, most basic in the world, the fact that the God who is portrayed by Moses in Isaiah, by Paul in the gospel today, is still among us. He is with us. And in fact, we know that as Catholic Christians, we actually consume the very body, divinity, the real thing, when we go to communion. So are we amazed by that? Have we lost that amazement? You know what they say about children at Christmas time, they throw everything away, but they play with the boxes. Because nobody can put the game together or whatever it is. But we used to have fun with cardboard boxes. I suspect children still do. You know, old blankets and sheets making forts, using the mind, the creativity. But I think we live in a culture that is distracting us from that simplicity and at the same time the absolutely amazing actions of God in our lives. Because God is acting amazingly in our lives. We wouldn't be here today. We wouldn't be breathing. We wouldn't be alive if God wasn't sustaining us, holding us in being. Scripture says if God were to withdraw his being, we would cease to exist. We wouldn't be. So here we're dealing with a God who created everything and the possibility of all this technology, and yet we look at the technology as the big gift or the joy, but not the God who's behind it. And if we were alive 2,000 years ago, we could follow Jesus, and we would have to live as the people lived, we'd probably be much more amazed at what was going on. And certainly the people were. Not that it convinced a lot of people. Certainly there were people who saw what Jesus did but didn't believe. We know there were lots of people at the miracle of the sun in Fatima, where our Holy Father was just visiting, didn't change their lives. So we're not talking about miracles for the sake of miracles, but for those of us who believe, they help us kind of get back into that mode of wonder and awe. And do we have that sense of awe and wonder in God? That God is everything and can do everything. And miracles still happen. And as I've said again and again, we have been gifted by God through the Holy Spirit with charisms of all kinds so that we can go and do what Jesus did. And, you know, we're not just doing tricks or stuff like that, but we're doing it to grab people's attention so they say, oh, that's about God. It's not about some mechanical device or some optical illusion. God's the real thing, and the technology, it's real, but it's not God. So we worship technology. We worship what can happen, and we want the latest. And you know, the whole culture of corporate America is basically make them buy the latest. Make them be discontented with what they have. And it's true. I don't care what computer I've had. after a while, I've said, why is this thing so slow? That's what they want us to think. Well, God's not like that. There's no new and improved version of God. God is God, always has been. So we have a responsibility, all of us in this room, to draw people's attention from all that neat stuff that's happening on Broadway or in movie theaters and say, who do you think's behind all this ultimately? And kind of talk with the person so they go back further and further. Where did human beings get their ideas, their intelligence? Where did they get their talents? So forth and so on. It's all about God. So even Back to the Future, even the ability to dream about time machines and going forward and backward in time, that's all in our minds, and it has been there for thousands of years. And yet we don't make the connection. That creativity, which is a great gift from God, comes from God. It's not from a machine. It's not from a computer. And as wonderful as technology is, what happened on Mount Tabor, Transfiguration, showing God, Jesus, for who he is and was and would be through his resurrection, that's the real thing. And it wasn't a trick. It wasn't some movie that was projected on a screen. It was the true God, the living God doing that. And the apostles, rightly so, were amazed. And of course, after Jesus was resurrected, again, the real thing. So over time, we lose that sense of awe and amazement. Children have it, and sadly, it kind of gets pushed out because they are pulled into this kind of technological created world, world created by human beings, but it's not of God. Again, it's not that it's bad, but it's something that can overwhelm the simplicity of who this God is and his desire for us and his desire for us to enter into a relationship with him. So again, it always comes back to us in this church. You know, these are not just nice ideas which we ponder, but what do we do with them? How do we witness to the world that there is a God? Do we talk about Jesus? That's what a disciple does. Gets into a conversation so that someone, no matter how many movies or virtual reality things they've seen, we can sort of prompt them, and they may go back and say, oh, you know, I had this experience several years ago. I don't know quite how it happened, but I had this sense of great peace and joy. And probably it came from God. And to help them see, yeah, it's from God. It wasn't from a computer game. It wasn't from some kind of machine. It came directly from God. And that's the real thing. That's the real in the world. But we have to go out. Number one, we have to be, again and again, in a sense, become childlike and take time to get rid of all the noise and the stuff and just sit quietly and maybe ask God, God, give me a sense of awe and wonder. Give me a sense of delight in what you have done. And think about it in our own lives when we've had that taste of God's presence in our lives. And just ponder it. They never leave us. I'm sure you all have had some. And to keep going back to it. That's the real thing. It's kind of like our mini transfiguration moment where something happened and we realized, that's it. That's what I want. That's really what I want. I don't care about the latest computer or TV. It's really God and God's love. So these stories really should be amazing us and filled with awe. I guess the closest thing we get to this sort of thing visually is if any of you ever went to the Sight and Sound Theater down in Lancaster. They have these biblical dramas each year which are really well done. And boy, they are something. But that's probably the closest visually that anybody's going to get us because they do such a good job. And yet you think about these stories as you're watching and you're thinking, wow, what must the people have thought who were actually there? Well, God is actually here, so we don't have to go anywhere. All we have to do is kind of quiet down our minds. Or, as Catherine Doherty said, this is what Westerners need to do more and more. fold the wings of our intellects. Fold the wings of our intellects. You know, we're always thinking we can figure it out. We can't. We can't figure God out. We got to let God be God and recognize that we are creatures. We're creations. We are the great creation of God. Do we ever think of that? That how wonderful we are, no matter who we are, no matter what we've done, God values us. There's no limit to God's love for us and how he is pursuing us. But if we don't stop to listen, we're going to go right by the reality of God in our lives. So we need to do that in our lives. We need to challenge one another, sit down with one another, go to adoration, go to rosary, go to prayer groups, get in a small group where we can share our stories of God, so that when we go out into the world, yeah, we're going to be amazed by all this technology, but we're always going to go back to the thought, nothing compared to God. Nothing compared to God. And we need to have that wonder and that awe so that we can truly give witness to God. So as we continue our Eucharist, think about your own walk with the Lord. Have you kind of lost that childlike openness to the Lord? Pray for wonder and awe. And then, you know, even say that to people. I wonder what the apostles were thinking when they were up on that mountain with Jesus. Can you imagine? And then imagine what it might. Put yourself in that story, going up with Jesus, and there it is. Because the more we do that, the more our focus will be on the Lord, and we will have that wonder and awe. And then people are going to want to know why we have this sense of openness and wonder in the world and hope and joy. And then we can tell them, not about artificial intelligence, it's about the real intelligence who is God in our lives. So think about those things, ponder them, talk with one another, because we know God is God and we're not. And so we need to let that word get out into the world. Now, yeah, it's sort of out there, but it's in competition with a lot of sparkly stuff which has no value, really, ultimately. But we have the great value, who is our God. So that's what we take out into the world. That's the best thing we could possibly have, the best gift we could give, the best thing we could possibly want for others, to let them see in some way God in their midst with a great amount of awe and wonder.